There are several ways in which groups are typically defined for the MCAT, and it's important to note that these definitions are generally not mutually exclusive. Keep that in the back of your head for now, and once we review their definitions, we'll illustrate this point more concretely. First, an important distinction is made between primary and secondary groups. In a nutshell, primary groups are long-lasting, with deep bonds formed among members, while secondary groups are short-lasting and more superficial. Family is a common example of a primary group, along with religious organizations and so on. On the other hand, classes in school and work colleagues are common examples of secondary groups. The trick here is not to confuse these examples with the definitions of primary and secondary groups. In particular, keep in mind that a primary group is defined by enduring relationships, even if those relationships don't make you feel warm and fuzzy, or even if they cause significant distress, whereas a secondary group is defined by superficial, more transient relationships, even if those relationships are very positive. Of course, someone might have difficult relationships with family members, and there are definitely tightly knit, stable workplaces where people get to know each other really well. Examples like this might seem to blur the distinction between primary and secondary groups, but that's not really true. They just illustrate how hard it can be to find universal examples of sociological phenomena. The fundamental distinction is always that primary groups are deep and long-lasting, and secondary groups are superficial and short-lasting. If this topic is tested on the MCAT, you'll be given a clear example, not some unusual borderline case, but be vigilant for traps that rely on the incorrect assumption that primary groups must always foster positive relationships. Now, to get even more specific, we can also distinguish between peer groups and family groups. Peer groups are made up of people who are often similar in terms of age, status, background, interests, and so on, and we usually think of those groups as being self-selected. So, while age is definitely a component, peer groups aren't quite as simple as just groups of people of the same age. For example, if you went to a large public high school, your high school class might not be a peer group in that sense. I mean, my high school class had over 400 people from tremendously different backgrounds, and we didn't exactly choose to be together. And I mean, some high schools are even larger than that. Extracurricular organizations in a high school can be better examples of peer groups. You choose to join them, they're defined by a shared interest, and they might tend to attract people from similar backgrounds, even if that's not a defining feature of the group. Family groups, on the other hand, are what they sound like, groups defined by genetic relationships and/or relationships like marriage and adoption. These are groups that you're typically born into or marry into. In some ways, family groups are more tight-knit than our peer groups, but they also involve people of very different ages, and they may span different cultural backgrounds as well, all of which can lead to some degree of tension. Next up, a distinction is also made between in-groups and out-groups. Basically, in-groups are categories that someone identifies as a member of or feels that he or she belongs to, while out-groups are the opposite. Examples of in-groups can be down-to-earth and small scale. That is, someone's extended family, school, or workplace can be in-groups. But most commonly, this distinction is applied to broader demographic categories like local identities, race, gender, sexual orientation, culture, religion, profession, and so on. With this in mind, the concept of in-groups versus out-groups becomes relevant for phenomena like stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination, which we discuss more elsewhere. All three categories of groups that we've discussed, that is, primary versus secondary groups, peer versus family groups, and in-groups versus out-groups, on some level involve distinguishing between people who are close to us and those who are more distant. Our final term that includes the word group, reference groups, is a little bit different. These are the groups that we compare ourselves to. In my experience, this is probably the category of groups that causes students the most confusion, despite its simple definition. So let's pause to think through the implications of this. Let's start with a simple question. Does someone have just one reference group? Well, no. People can have multiple different reference groups for different aspects of their identity. To take a simple example, think of someone who is both a physician and a serious runner. For things relating to medicine, patient care, and so on, his or her reference group will consist of other physicians. But when it comes to running a 10K, other runners will be the reference group. Now, here's a question that's a little bit trickier. In the example we just worked through, our physician/runner belong to both of the reference groups. Is that necessarily the case? Again, no. You can certainly compare yourself to groups that you don't belong to. In fact, if you're watching this video, odds are very good that you compare yourself to students who have been accepted to med school even though you aren't one yet. So, is there any technical limit on what a reference group can be? Again, the answer is not really. I mean, it is much more commonplace for someone to use in-groups as reference groups, but there's no technical reason why someone couldn't compare themselves to members of an out-group. The key point for the MCAT is that for reference group to be the correct answer, there has to be an explicit indicator that someone evaluates his or herself with reference to that group.